radical left has taken over the Democratic Party.
Hello and welcome to Think Progressively, covering politics and all the other chaos life has to offer. This is episode 27, recorded on Friday, March 5th from Milwaukee. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jason.
And on today's episode, we will examine modern-day voter suppression and what the GOP is trying to do to steal your vote. But first, the headlines.
The fact is that everything he's saying so far is simply a lie. I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar.
Up first in headlines, Jason has some updates on the Andrew Cuomo allegations.
Now, as predicted, we have more people coming forward. We now have 3 accusers, 2 former aides, and a woman he met at a 2019 wedding who he forcibly kissed against her will.
Oh, God.
Or at least attempted to, I guess, is the story. There's a picture that goes along with it where he's literally holding
her face. Is that the one?
In his hands.
Oh, my, that's awful.
And she looks terrified.
She does look terrified.
And was terrified, according to her account. Cuomo refused to resign during a recent COVID update press conference that he was giving and gave the usual assaulter apology. I'm sorry if you took it that way. The actual quote was, I never knew at the time that I was making anyone feel uncomfortable.
Screw off. Oh my God.
I never ever meant to offend anyone or hurt anyone or cause anyone pain. I feel terrible that these people felt uncomfortable, felt hurt, felt pain from the interactions. And I'm embarrassed by it, and I feel bad from it. It's, of course, not actually taking responsibility for his actions. He's taking responsibility for how other people felt about his actions, which is typical language from people that are in these situations. It doesn't matter what your intentions were, and it's not just because that's what's in your head doesn't make it the truth. When someone else tells you the exact opposite of what you thought you were doing, their perspective is just as valid as yours. And that's what I think these people can never seem to realize.
Well, because he's a narcissist. He's a bully. And he's just an overall garbage person, in my opinion. I can't stand him. He needs to go.
Yes, and hopefully he will resign soon, but I doubt it. And when shown that photographic evidence backing up the accuser at the wedding, his response was, you can go find hundreds of pictures of me kissing people. Men, women. It is my usual and customary way of greeting.
Why? Oh.
First sign that you're a creep. No, that's okay. I sexually assault everyone I meet.
What's even happening?
I don't know. This is the same thing that we hear from so many people when they try to dodge these types of allegations. And the fact that Andrew Cuomo was someone who in the past has pointed out that these types of excuses are meaningless. And we really should take people's accounts seriously and learn from them. And now he's in this situation and he's using the same tired excuses and rationalization.
Showing they never really cared about it to begin with.
Or at least didn't even really understand it.
I'm sure it's both.
And we have another update from our QAnon episode.
Let's do it. I'm ready.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Was Trump inaugurated as the 19th president of the United States yesterday?
Are we talking like the mainstream media's account or like the real accounts?
Was there anything on TV?
I've seen online from like really reputable Star83
TikTok
at
accounts?
AOL.com and TikTok accounts that Trump actually was inaugurated as a spite to Joe Biden. Secretly, though.
So this is the theory, and it's kind of meshed with a sovereign citizen thing, so it's even crazier than normal QAnon.
It is.
That at some point, I think it was the mid-1800s, the United States incorporated as a corporation when it established the federal government.
Therefore, we're actually a corporation.
And not a country.
Yep.
And that every law and amendment passed since then does not count.
It's all invalid.
And that's how these people try to get out of paying taxes.
Including
too.
Donald Trump's presidency.
Right, yeah, it would have to include that. So Ulysses S. Grant is the last legitimate president, and he would have been the 18th president. And back then, the inauguration day was March 4th. So they were pointing to yesterday, March 4th, that Trump would be signed in or inaugurated as the 19th president as part of this crazy conspiracy.
These are just becoming more like doomsday predictions.
Yeah, I'm sure the next date will be coming shortly.
I'm sure.
And as mainstream news sources were picking up on this theory, and it was obvious to everyone that it wasn't going to happen. You already saw people trying to walk this back this week and say, no, that date, that's a fake date. You can't trust anything you hear from the news, despite all these videos and theories and posts about it.
God, this is so stupid. Let's move on to more stupid stuff.
Continuing in stupidity.
This one actually makes me angry because it's so bad, and I'm seeing it. Like, this one makes me so much angry because I think it's like so much popular than the BS QAnon stuff. Like, I'm seeing this all over my Facebook feed.
It's all Fox News is talking about.
Right. Jason, is Dr. Seuss canceled?
Well, this week.
No, there's no well. Don't you give me the well. It's no. It's just no, period. Don't give me no.
Joe Biden and the Democrats canceled Dr. Seuss. I don't know if you didn't notice that, but you can't buy any Dr. Seuss books, new or used, anywhere. If you have them in your house, federal agents will storm your house and take them. There's burnings going on every street corner in America.
It's cancel culture run amok.
Thing 1 and Thing 2 have both been captured and sent to internment camps.
And are currently being waterboarded as we speak.
The Cat in the Hat is now the Cat in Guantanamo Bay. Horton will never hear a who again. They were murdered. I'm out of jokes, I think. If you eat green eggs and ham, you'll get 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I don't know. That's it. I'm done.
There is a one fish, a two fish, and there is a blue fish, but no red fish anymore. It's illegal to be a red fish in this country.
So the real story is the publishing company responsible for the Dr. Seuss library has decided, not through government pressure or any type of law requiring them to, but all on their own out of their best business interests, to stop publishing 6 relatively unknown Dr. Seuss books. McElligot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Eggs Super, The Cat's Quizzer, and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, and finally, If I Ran the Zoo, because of racist and insensitive imagery.
So let's make something very clear here. What Dr. Seuss Enterprises did was work with a panel of experts and educators to go through Dr. Seuss's catalog to make sure that their books were inclusive. And they did this last year. This is nothing even new. They made this decision last year to stop publishing these books because what they found in them were legitimately racist. And that's no shocker because Dr. Seuss wrote in the 30s and 40s where a lot of people were racist.
And he made political cartoons, some of which were encouraging the internment camps for the Japanese during World War II. One of the worst things we've ever done as a country, encouraged by Dr. Seuss.
He was also super anti-Semitic.
At least at one point in his life.
Yes.
I've heard reports that he came around later in life and renounced a lot of the things that he said and did earlier. Although he was resistant to change, which, I mean, he died in the early 90s, I believe. People had been talking about these books in particular. I think If I Ran the Zoo, he did change one of the drawings slightly in the 70s to make it a little less racist. There's an Asian caricature that he removed the color yellow from and took the I don't know what you call it, ponytail off of the character because it was like what you would expect a racist Asian stereotype to be during that time.
And I can't remember which one, but I think in one of these two, like he actually referred to someone as a Japanese. And I think, and here's where I get super angry with this whole thing, where you're seeing Fox News talking about how the Cat in the Hat is canceled. I'm seeing this stupid freaking poem go on Facebook right now that all my friends and family are sharing about how they canceled Mr. Potato Head and they canceled Dr. Seuss and they're going to cancel me next and whatever BS they're talking about. As of right now, Dr. Seuss's books are, I think, 16 or maybe 18 of like the top 20 best-selling children's books on Amazon that you can get.
And sales of Mr. Potato Head have skyrocketed. So this is what we need to do, Joe. We need to start a company selling some kind of mildly terrible stereotypical product
and then just get canceled.
Yeah, and then start a campaign against it and then make lots of money.
This is so dumb. And what makes me even angrier with this whole thing is that they keep using the term they canceled Dr. Seuss. They are trying to take your books away from you. They are trying to ruin the things that you love. Who's they?
Capitalism, in this case. They made a business decision to not and these are books that I've never heard of any of these. I'm not a big Dr. Seuss guy, but I was more of a Little Golden Book kid.
I knew of And to Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street and If I Ran the Zoo. I didn't know the others.
Those are the two that they seem to be leading with on all of these stories.
Well, and the reason why and I think I saw it on Mulberry Street, was like a big one, is because that's his first book he published. First children's book he published. This is so dumb. I hate it. I hate this cancel culture BS. Let's stop being stupid and start worrying over real important things like a freaking pandemic.
No, the pandemic is over. Didn't you hear?
Ooh. It's a good
Look at that transition.
It's a good segue, but I'm really upset by that.
So according to Texas and Mississippi, everyone is fine. They have rolled back their mask mandates and lifted all COVID restrictions.
It's true. Greg Abbott announced it on Twitter.
Texas, who is currently 45th in percentage of population fully vaccinated at 7.5%, and 8th in new cases per 100,000 people. Sounds like maybe a rash decision to declare your state open for business and lift all restrictions on gatherings and bars and gyms and nightclubs.
We're so close, Jason. We're so close. Why are we ruining it when we're so close?
And Mississippi is tied for 33rd in vaccine rollout at 8.1% of its population fully vaccinated, so that's both vaccinations, and right in the middle at 24th in new cases. So not great either, not quite as horrible as Texas. Texas is about the last state that you would say should maybe be stopping its restrictions. Mississippi's more right in the middle. But according to their governors, everything is fine. Nothing to worry about. Business as usual. And this is also coming amid new strains of the virus, which again was predicted with the whole, we'll just let it run rampant through the population and see what happens. Mutations, that's what happens. And comes directly after the CDC warned against complacency during the vaccine rollout. And in another tie-in to our last story, I think Texas might actually have a bigger problem with public education than they do with any COVID restrictions.
Tell me about it.
I saw a conspiracy theory that just completely astounded me, especially as a resident of Wisconsin. There are a lot of viral videos that have been going around, and I don't know if you've seen any of these yet. I highly recommend that you click on that link and take a look. And for all of our listeners, it'll be in the show notes. There are people saying that the snow
No.
that fell during the Texas winter storm that knocked out their power is fake, produced by the government and or Bill Gates. And people are literally taking snowballs and trying to burn them with lighters and using that as evidence that the snow is fake because they don't immediately melt, I guess. And they're looking at the soot that's created from the fuel that's in the lighter or the match or whatever else you use, because it's not going to burn very well when you hold it up against ice, as evidence that it's plastic?
Plastic?
Yeah, because, you know, when you burn plastic, it turns black and sooty.
Oh my God.
But you could literally hold up a lighter to like a glass and it'll do the same thing.
Right.
So not only do these people not understand snow, they don't understand combustion. I don't know. I think it's just people going outside and playing with snow and then just coming to their own conclusions and then trying to get views on TikTok. But there are a lot of these videos and it's craziness and it's not science. And I mean, the same snow that you're saying, see, it doesn't melt when I hold it up to a lighter. Just leave it on your counter for 2 minutes. It's gonna melt. So one of the videos that I watched was literally a lady doing this, and I can hear the water rushing through her gutters while she's doing this because the snow on her roof is melting and being like, see, it's not melting. It's not even real snow. So I don't know if these people, again, they're probably just doing it for views because it was a popular subject, but why was it a popular subject? What is wrong with us?
Jason, this is the free market.
A marketplace of ideas. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I don't think so.
Ayn Rand had some good ideas. Well, let's talk about some good news before I lose my mind with our next story, Jason. The good news with the pandemic is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been approved for emergency use by the FDA and is now being set to make and distribute over 100 million doses, by late May.
I believe they promised that everyone would be able to get vaccinated.
That's what Biden said, yes. Yeah. Which is amazing if people didn't actively try to ruin it. Because in our next story, U.S. bishops from the Catholic Church are now telling people to avoid the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of abortion,
How do those things tie in?
religion, and stupidity.
So the concern here is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was derived using cell lines that originally came from aborted fetal material.
In the 70s and 80s!
Now, I have some issues with the way cell lines are used in medicine, but that has more to do with the fact that a lot of these cell lines were taken from patients who were never informed or never consented to their use. The most prolific and most used cell line known is from Henrietta Lacks. It's known as the Hella. They use the first initials from her first and last name.
It's hell of a cell line you got there.
Nice joke. She was a 31-year-old African-American woman in, I believe it was 1951, who developed a very virulent cervical cancer, and she was brought to the hospital. They took a biopsy. She died very quickly. It was a very, very aggressive form of cancer. And what they found out was that they could easily grow the cells from that biopsy, and that they would last and divide and continue to grow, which up to that point, whenever they had taken cell cultures, they would usually last a day or two before dying off, whereas hers were extremely resilient and were basically immortal, quote unquote, as this was from 1951, and they're still in use today. Now, the problem with that is the original culture was not patented. It was actually given freely to anyone who asked for it, which that's good. It would have been nice if her family had been made aware of what was being done, but also down the road, different strains of that culture were patented and used to generate millions and billions of dollars for pharmaceutical and medical companies. Meanwhile, her family is poor and doesn't even have access to medical care a lot of the time, during the last 70 years, that they're genetically linked to the most prolific cell line we've ever had. But that's not what the Catholic Church is objecting to. They're worried that some of the cell tissue came from non-people. How very Christian of them.
And I don't want to hear a damn thing about talking about morals and ethics from the Catholic Church when we just did a freaking story about them, 2 weeks ago? About how they sold boys into sex slavery?
Gotta protect the children up until the point where they're born.
The little bit of good news, or the silver lining with this story, is that this is technically in contradiction to what Pope Francis has said, where he said your duty is to get the vaccine regardless of what it is, just so we can go back to our healthy society, which is good, I guess. And I guess other Catholics have also said that if you have the choice, which most people don't have the choice, to pick their vaccine brand, then try to avoid Johnson & Johnson. But if you don't have a choice, get the Johnson & Johnson, and God will forgive you for apparently using aborted baby tissue.
Oh, and an update that just came in. I just spoke with Jesus. He said he's fine with it. So all of our conservative religious friends out there that are worried about this, Jesus gives you the big old thumbs up.
And here's why this is so dangerous. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine is a 1-dose vaccine as opposed to the Pfizer and Moderna, which is a 2-dose vaccine. That means, on top of the fact that Johnson & Johnson can probably distribute it way better than both Pfizer and Moderna, it means we can get it into more impoverished areas. The fact that it's a 1-dose vaccine makes it much better at vaccinating those same areas, because the idea of having to come back for a vaccine when you're actually working 60 hours a week is not the most plausible thing to do. So what the Catholic Church is doing is not only telling people that they should think about what vaccine they're getting, they're telling them to not get a vaccine at all.
My takeaway from all of this is, if you're going to church, stop. It's better for your health.
The vaccine is definitely better than church. I'll give you that.
Moving on.
Speaking of cancel culture, Biden lost his first cabinet appointee.
Why was she not confirmed?
Well, staying true to CPAC's America Uncanceled slogan, she was canceled because of mean tweets that Republicans thought were distasteful.
And this is Neera Tanden, who I am happy she was not confirmed.
I mean, don't get me wrong, me too.
And not because of her mean tweets, more of her history running a quote-unquote liberal think tank, which was just a corporate and international interests funded group, the Center for American Progress, which she spent 9 years as the head of, and she was going to be the budget chief. Not really the person as a progressive that you want in charge of that position. It's a big appointment. It's an important appointment. It pretty much touches every aspect of the budget for federal agents and has a lot of ties to the economy, essentially. So yes, she did send out some mean tweets and has been called unprofessional because of that.
Remember, these are the same people who also approved Jeff Sessions after there was definitive proof of his absolute racism.
And Brett Kavanaugh, who really, really likes beer.
All the beer with Squee and... Who's the other one?
I forgot.
I only remember Squee because that's a great nickname.
Donkey Punch? I don't know.
No, that's a sitcom. The Adventures of Donkey Punch and Squee.
So I'm glad she didn't get confirmed.
We'll find someone better.
Yeah, there are a lot of better people out there, but not for the reason that you're probably hearing. That's who cares that she's mean. It's not really important. It's important that she is just a corporate shill and doesn't need to be in that position. And now for our worst.
On to
headline.
local news. Now that we talked about the South so much, how's the North doing?
Well, Wisconsin Republicans introduce a bill to ban transgender athletes from girls and women's sports in Wisconsin, from kindergarten through college, and always directed at just women, too, transgender women, as we talked about in the last episode. Representative Barb, which is the most Wisconsin name ever, Barb Dietrich, a Republican from Oconomowoc, who introduced the Wisconsin measures, said that Governor Tony Evers would be sexist if he doesn't support them.
Screw off.
If the government is truly for women, why would he not sign something like this? It is wholly unfair for a woman to be competing and think she's only competing against other females.
Which she is.
Yeah, just blatantly disregarding that trans women are women.
Well, I mean, let's be real here. That's what it is, right? This is just an attack to discredit the legitimacy and existence of trans people. That's all it is.
The Wisconsin bill would allow students to join teams only that corresponded to their biological sex as assigned by a doctor at birth, unless the sport is classified as co-ed.
Why would we have co-ed sports?
So the other unintended consequence for this, as you can see, it's targeted towards women's sports, but if the wording is how they say it is here, you're going to get trans men competing against women in sports as well, which has happened with these laws in other areas. And there's video of it you can watch. There's a wrestling team where you have a trans man just destroying female wrestlers because they passed a law like this.
And they still hated on the student, by the way, for that, too.
Oh, certainly. And though it's not his fault at all, he didn't do anything to make this happen. It's these lawmakers who pass these biased, hateful laws that lead to these types of situations.
And the fact that they're trying to project this as saving women's sports or protecting women's sports, screw off. That's complete nonsense, because throughout any time in history, there are complete dismissal of any type of women's issue that women will actually bring up. If you want to talk about equality in women's sports, let's talk about funding Title IX better. Let's talk about the idea of having equality in sports just to begin with in academic programs. But no, they only talk about women's sports when it means they get to persecute a marginalized group of people in the United States. That's all this is. And the idea of having co-ed teams just for a couple of trans students is insane.
They're just using women's sports as a shield to hide behind so they can enact these anti-trans legislation. That's it. I mean, that's the bottom line. There really is not much else. Eventually, we'll do an episode about trans athletes, because I think it's important, and it's something that comes up all the time, but there is a lot to talk about it.
Well, and there's so much misinformation because people don't understand the science behind it either.
Yes,
because
and that's
there are
why
actual procedures in place for trans athletes right now that help level the playing field to begin with. And Republicans do not care because they don't understand the science.
They don't understand science. They're out there burning snowballs with lighters.
And blaming the Green New Deal for the problem of coal. And telling people to not get a vaccine because of aborted baby ghosts. You know, Jason, sometimes this country really disappoints me.
Yes, it does. On to our main segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? It's hard to get any word in with this clown.
Let's talk voter suppression. Since the November election, more than 253 bills were designed to create barriers to voting that have begun making their way through 43 state legislators, and it's increasing as we speak. That's a problem.
And this is all being pushed on the idea that the election was stolen somehow, and that there are hordes of dead people and illegal immigrants all voting Democrat, and it's going to destroy our country if we don't change the laws and make it harder for minorities to vote.
Well, and I was going to say that too. Let's keep in mind that these 253 bills are all GOP-sponsored bills. You have one party who is actively trying to suppress the vote, especially of people of color in this country, because they lost an election.
Said it before, the Republican Party is the party of voter suppression. They do not do well in high turnout elections. We saw it in the presidential election. We saw it in the Georgia Senate runoff. When people are engaged and educated and voting, the Republicans don't do so well.
So let's talk about the history a little bit.
So, our land of the free with our God-given rights,
where according to the 1776 Project, all men were actually created equal.
Originally, only white landowning men were allowed to vote in the United States. So right off, our country is founded on voter suppression. Most of the population was not able to vote.
But that's only if you listen to that Commie 1619 Project.
The 15th Amendment ensured that people could not be denied the right to vote because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It also enabled states to oversee elections as they saw fit. Shortly after the Civil War, Mississippi's Democrats were appalled when 2 black men became members of the Senate. This is back when the Democrats were the racist party. They then initiated a campaign of intimidation at the polls that succeeded in restoring white Democrats to power in Mississippi by 1881. Mississippi became one of the first states to put forth a grandfather clause. Ever wonder where that term came from?
I do.
That permitted registering anyone whose grandfather was qualified to vote before the Civil War, essentially disenfranchising all of the black people who were not allowed to vote before the Civil War and whose grandfathers could not vote.
So real progressive legislation here.
Very much so. Not targeted directly at a specific minority group or anything. This voter suppression tactic cut the percentage of black men eligible to vote from over 90% to less than 6% in 1892. Women still could not vote at all.
Remember, equality, right?
That's what we're built on. It said all men are created equal.
We're the good guys in our story. I don't know how, but we are.
Many other states implemented such tactics as poll taxes, where you had to pay to vote, literacy tests, and English language requirements to deliberately reduce voting among African Americans, immigrants, and low-income populations. These tactics became known as Jim Crow laws. Efforts like the one in Mississippi and other southern states lasted for almost a century. So these laws have been on the books for a very, very long time. Women were afforded the right to vote by the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, so just had its 100th anniversary last year. In practice, though, only white women were able to take advantage of this provision. So following the civil rights movement in the 60s, Congress passed and Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. This is why when Trump was saying he did more for black people than any other president in history, maybe except for Lincoln, you heard a lot of people say, there's no way that you did more than Lyndon Johnson did. And they're talking about this because he signed, 1, the Civil Rights Act, and 2, the Voting Rights Act. The law outlawed the most common voter suppression tactics and created federal oversight of states and localities with histories of voter discrimination. So that's an important thing to remember there. It created federal oversight of states and localities with histories of voter discrimination.
And I do want to bring up really quick before we start getting into modern efforts is that this is not even including gerrymandering, right?
Yeah, we purposefully left it out.
Yeah, these were just the direct tactics of voter suppression that were used, where gerrymandering is such a big topic in its own way that we want to cover that in a completely different episode. So just be aware of that. There's even more voter suppression that goes on because of gerrymandering that we're not talking about.
So that's a very brief history of voter suppression. We don't really talk about voter intimidation, which is something that happened quite frequently.
Especially in the South.
African Americans were lynched when they tried to vote, things like that. We're kind of trying to keep it brief, but that's the history of voter suppression. So that takes us to modern efforts. courts. The big landmark here that we need to talk about is the Shelby versus Holder case that was decided in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court regarding the constitutionality of two provisions of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Section 5, which required certain states and local governments to obtain federal pre-clearance before implementing any changes to their voting laws or practices. That's what we just talked about, where any area that had a history of voter suppression had to get clearance from the federal government before they could make any changes. And Section 4B, which contained the coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions were subject to pre-clearance based on their histories of discrimination in voting. And so essentially what this did is overturn a huge portion of the Voting Rights Act, and it wasn't based on that the Voting Rights Act or anything in it was unconstitutional. They basically said because these maps and this formula were made in the 1960s, they don't apply anymore, and Congress should redo them. And until they redo them, these things are not in effect. And of course, the Republican-led Congress never decided to redo them. So they've basically been defunct.
I would say shelved and defunct, yeah.
Since 2013. And that is what allows a lot of these bills that we're talking about being presented to be presented by states and local counties.
And let's put a pin in Shelby v. Holder for the end of the episode, because we'll talk about that too with H.R. 1.
So what has been done? What are the modern voter suppression tactics?
Well, I think a good place to start would be, how about voter ID laws?
Currently, we have 7 states that have extremely strict voter ID laws. You have to have a photo ID to vote. Those are Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee. These are all kind of hee-haw states. Kind of what you'd expect. Oh, and Wisconsin. That one sticks out a little bit to me. Keep in mind that Scott Walker was our governor for a while. Many other states have less strict voter ID requests, where they will ask you to see your ID when you vote. You don't necessarily have to have it. You can still vote using a provincial ballot, things like that. But in those states we just went through, you have to have a photo ID to vote.
And why would that be problematic?
Because for less well-off people that can't just drive to the DMV or drive to a clerk's office to get an ID, it's a lot harder for them. Elderly, poor, disabled students, a lot of times you're not in the state that you're registered to vote in. It's a lot harder to have to go back and get an ID, all that kind of stuff. It's harder for those people, but it's easy for the wealthy. They can take off work. They generally are, in a position where it's no big deal. Yeah, I just have to go down in the middle of the business day, sit at the DMV for 3 hours and get my ID renewed or whatever. So for those people, it doesn't matter. And I'd include myself in that. I don't have an issue getting an ID, but I'm fortunate in that I always have had transportation, and I live in an area where going to the DMV is not that much of a hassle. So yes, for some people it is easy. And you hear this argument, and I was one of them. We've talked about before, we were both somewhat conservative earlier on in our lives, and this was one where I was like, yeah, we should have voter ID. I don't understand. It's not hard to get an ID until you really think about it and put yourself in someone else's situation and think about all of the ramifications that are entailed there. You start to understand, no, I actually lead a much easier life than a lot of other people. And for me, just thinking, oh yeah, it's real easy to get an ID. It's no big deal. You just ask for an hour off of work. You go down there, whatever, no big deal. I've got all these other forms of identification easily to me, but not everybody does.
So let's try to at least steel man the Republicans' argument who pushed for these voter ID laws. The main idea is that they're trying to protect us from voter fraud. So would that be a good reason to have these ID laws in place?
It's a reason. The problem with that is that there has never been any evidence that this does protect against any sort of voter fraud or that the voter fraud existed to begin with.
And I was just going to say that too. Decades of voter evidence show that voter ID laws have barely minimal effect on actual voter fraud cases or increases of voter fraud cases. So the fact that we have actually voter IDs, and again, I understand, right? The idea of having a voter ID makes it sound like it's going to be a more secure election. But you need to understand that our security procedures are already better than having a need for a voter ID anyway. So we don't need to have a voter ID, which already makes it harder, like Jason said, for a lot of people. So we're just making it harder for absolutely no reason whatsoever, other than to make people who are already in power feel good about themselves.
And most of what you heard about voter fraud in this past election actually comes from those other forms, such as signature verification. Oh, these signatures don't match. How many times have you heard that? Oh, they had thousands of signatures that didn't match. Even in states like Wisconsin, where we have voter ID, they're still falling back on, well, the signatures don't look the same.
Well, and voter ID caused a lot of chaos. I remember back in our April primary election and also our Supreme Court election. At least in Wisconsin, if you want to register to vote or want to request an absentee ballot, you have to submit a picture of a voter ID to the Wisconsin voting website.
To your clerk. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but you can do it through the website.
Yeah, but that's where it goes.
Right. So for a lot of people, it's just a lot easier to take a picture of their ID. I did it myself this way with their smartphone. The problem was that there were so many cases of elderly people not understanding of what taking a picture of your voter ID with your smartphone meant, where they kept delivering selfies to clerks, which were not actually counted as voter IDs, which delayed the process even further. So our voter ID just created an absolute mess of our entire April primary election in Wisconsin.
And this is, again, during a global pandemic.
Correct.
I can tell you, my own mom, I was not able to register and get an absentee ballot for her, despite I could have easily taken a picture of her ID, but I could never, despite the fact that she's voted in every election probably for the last 60 years, I could not find her in the system. And that had probably something to do with the fact that she's got a hyphenated last name, or that she's been in voter registration for so long they used to not capture the year of your birth in there. And so they tell you, oh, try to use 1900. That's kind of a default. We talked about this during the voter fraud thing.
Did.
People used that as like, well, see, they're 120 years old and they're voting. Well, no, the reason is because the voting system doesn't have that information at default. But using every method I could think of, I was not able to get her registered online. So it did create a bigger obstacle for her, being older than it did for me, which again goes to show what these laws do.
So when your conservative aunt or uncle tries to tell you that voter ID laws are a good thing because it protects us against voter fraud, you need to let them know that the evidence is not in their favor. Voter ID laws are mostly just for show.
And next, that brings us to voter registration purges. And this is where they take the voter registration rolls and they have an arbitrary number of years to go back. Say if you haven't voted in the last 6 years, you haven't voted in the last 4 years, you haven't voted in the last 2 elections. They consider those to be stale, invalid registrations, and they remove them from the lists. Again, this is something that sounds like reasonable. I don't like the time frames that they're given. I would rather go back a little bit further and say, if you haven't voted in the last 20 years, you're probably not voting again. You moved, you died, some other reason. But that doesn't kind of disenfranchise anyone when you do that. So most of what you see for these registration purges being proposed by Republican lawmakers are much shorter times, usually between 4 and 8 years.
Which is also something we saw recently in Wisconsin.
Yes, we are a very, very bad state for voter suppression, which we will get to again. But as an example, in Ohio in 2019, the Republican Secretary of State Frank LaRose was supposed to remove 235,000 names that he'd been given as part of their voter registration purge. Instead of just removing them as he was told to do, he actually gave the list to a voting rights group in the state and let them scour through the data and see whether they could find any irregularities. They found more than 40,000 of those names had been wrongly added to the purge list by county election officials or by election software error. And that is the problem. And the thing is, a lot of states do not have same-day voter registration, which one thing that we do
we're actually pretty lucky
in Wisconsin, which means if you were removed from the voter registration list
and didn't know it,
you don't know, and that you go to vote on election day and they tell you you're not registered, there's nothing you can do. You cannot vote. That is disenfranchising people, and that's a problem. The next tactic we have is reducing the number of polling locations. And this is probably the biggest outcome after that change to the Voting Rights Act that we have. This is the biggest tactic in those areas that have had historic problems with voter suppression. The biggest thing that you see is them reducing the number of polling locations. So in the 6 years since the Shelby v. Holder decision, 1,688 polling sites across 13 states have been closed. And what this does, it makes it harder to travel to your polling location, because it's usually further away from you than the original one was.
It takes longer to vote.
It has bigger lines. Usually people will just not go if they see a line out the door down the block, which if you saw those videos from this election, it is horrible in some areas where literally the line is down the street for people to vote. Reducing polling locations, especially in urban areas where you know the vote's going to be heavily Democratic.
Well, and on top of that,
and minority.
and for people of color too. And this is where you see a lot of states in the South getting hit the worst by this type of stuff. Texas is really bad for cutting polling locations, especially in Austin and Houston.
And this is probably one of the most effective and most easily targeted tactics that can be used to suppress the vote.
And that's why you usually see a lot of these like viral videos or viral like reports of people standing in line for 7 to 9 hours to go vote. Can you, Jason, can you even imagine spending 7 to 9 hours just to go vote? I think I voted in our last election. It took me maybe 5 minutes to go vote.
And that was the spring primary?
Yeah.
Which is kind of understandable.
But fine, let's go back even to the November election. For most of the people who live in my city, maybe 10, 15 minutes tops.
Yeah, I think...
And that was during a rush hour.
The last big election that I voted in person would have been probably the 2016 presidential election. And that's probably the longest wait I've ever had.
I was just going to ask, how long do you think was the longest time you've ever had to wait for a vote?
I think that was about 15 to 20 minutes that I had to wait in a line. And that seemed like forever.
My worst was actually when I was in college and I voted on campus. I remember I had to wait, I think approximately about an hour to an hour and a half to go vote. So yeah, it sucked. It was really bad. And I saw a lot of students get out of line because they had to go do other things because the line wasn't moving fast enough. People got stuff to do. They can't sit around and wait to go vote.
And kind of going along with reducing the polling locations is cutting early voting. So if you know that you're going to have to wait for 8 hours, if you have the opportunity to vote early, that can kind of curtail that issue, at least for the people that have the foresight to do that. So same thing, you have states that will cut the early voting, limit the hours, especially nights and weekends, the things that really make it easy for working people to go vote. And specifically, in the last 10 years, we have 4 states that have cut early voting: Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and of course, Wisconsin.
And that number's going to get a lot larger
very
soon.
This is a big target of a lot of these. Early voting, absentee voting is being heavily targeted in all of this legislation that's being put forth.
Well, let's talk about that. So you may have heard in the news about Georgia's state legislature, because even though Georgia went blue for Biden and for the Senate runoffs, they're still a very extremely red state with an extremely Republican majority Senate. And their response to an extremely high black voter turnout, which carried Democrats like Joe Biden, John Ossoff, and Raphael Warnock to victory, was to not redo their structure and say, hey, maybe we don't appeal to black voters, but it was, hey, how can we stop these black people from voting? So the Georgia State Senate just initially passed a group of bills drastically cutting access to Georgians all around the state, specifically black voters. And now, they never actually said people who are black can't vote. What they did was target specific early voting procedures that a lot of black voters took advantage of.
And I did see some numbers that stated that about double the amount of early voting comes from the black community versus white communities in the same area. I think that was out of Ohio and North Carolina. Both of the numbers were the same, about double.
Same as Georgia, or?
No, they both had the same amount
okay.
People voting, like the same ratio, the 2-to-1 black versus other nationalities
Gotcha.
Voting early.
Going back to the example, the Georgia Senate drastically cut down on early voting on Sundays, which was heavily used by black communities through programs such as Souls to the Polls. Now, Souls to the Polls is a voting rights group that has chapters all around the state. Milwaukee actually has a Souls to the Polls chapter, if you didn't know, Jason. And what they do is they go to predominantly black churches and they have them all go to the polls together so they can all go vote.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Finally, hear some good news about religion, I guess. So the big problem with not being able to vote on Sunday is it kind of ruins the whole point of the Souls to the Polls program from going to church to the polls on Sunday. And that's why Republicans completely tarnished it. So, okay, maybe that's just Georgia. Even in Republican haven of Iowa,
home of the weirdest primary elections in the country.
And Steve King. And what else?
Corn.
Corn.
There's a lot of corn.
But Nebraska's known for corn. What's Iowa good for?
Pigs?
Sure, why not? Sorry to our Iowa listeners. We have any Iowa listeners.
I don't know what a Hawkeye is, so I don't think that's a real thing.
In my defense, I don't know what a Buckeye is either.
I do know that one. It's a tree
It's
or a
leaf.
nut from a tree.
I thought it was a leaf or something.
Well, the leaf is like their logo, but it's a Buckeye is the tree. It's like a chestnut.
No, both are stupid. Go Badgers. Even in Iowa, where Republicans won, obviously, the presidency and in the Senate race, their record voter turnout and an infinitesimal amount of voter fraud in the last 20 years prompted their state Republican Party to pass a ton of strict anti-voting laws. And let's go through a couple of them. Again, in Republican-held Iowa, which Republicans won, they also now cut early voting by 9 days, similar to like what Jason talked about before, closed polls an hour earlier, tightened rules on absentee voting, and stripped the authority from county auditors to determine election processes for their own counties. Apparently, limited government's not a thing anymore. And why are they doing this? Well, during debate on the state Senate floor, State Senator Jim Carlin, a Republican, said, quote, "Most of us in my caucus and the Republican caucus believe the election was stolen. They are pushing more conspiracy theories and lies to limit people's rights to vote." And it doesn't even matter. State Democrats were criticizing the Iowa GOP, saying that this is a win-win for them, where either A, they actually believe that the election was stolen and they can just go off and change voting rules for these conspiracy theories, or B, they don't actually care about them, which is probably what the real cause is, but they get to have it their way anyway, thus locking in more Republican supremacy in our election system. This is really bad, Jason.
One thing that I think the GOP needs to worry about is that usually these things that target minority voters do also tend to have the same effect to poor white voters, who is increasingly becoming the GOP's base. So they should be a little bit concerned that they're going to chop off their own nose to spite their face.
Well, polls are even showing that from the 2020 election. They're literally suppressing their own voters' right to vote. It's insanity.
Because they haven't changed their tactics for 100 years, as we just went through. I mean, they adopted the tactics, I guess, of the Democrats, but I mean, it's the tactics of whatever is the racist party at the time.
Right, exactly. So what can we do about this? Congress needs to pass the H.R. 1 bill, or the For the People Act. Now, good news, the House of Representatives actually did just vote and pass this bill. This is one of the biggest sweeping pieces of legislation that the Biden administration can actually put forth and sign. And it would completely revolutionize how we think about our elections. Like in an actual good way, not the crazy Republican way.
And just like the Equality Act and pandemic relief bills, this is not the first time the House has passed H.R. 1.
That's correct.
And just like those other bills, it was not taken up in the Republican-led Senate.
So what does H.R. 1 actually do? Well, a couple of things. First, it would require require states to hold early voting for at least 15 days before an election. It would establish automatic voter registration, which we didn't even talk about. So those who would provide information to state institutions like the DMV or public universities would be automatically registered unless they opt out. Now, some states are already doing this, like Washington, I think, and is it Oregon?
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, a couple of states are actually already doing...
Technically, every state does it for jury duty, right? So you just use the same system.
Yeah. And their voter turnout is actually much better than the rest of the country. Shocker, right?
One less thing to worry about.
The bill would also expand vote by mail, make Election Day a federal holiday.
That definitely needs to be done. That's the way it is in most of the rest of the world.
Well, and why wouldn't we? We talked about the idea of having to get off for work just to go vote, and especially in places where you have to wait 9 hours to go vote. This would be a huge way of rethinking how we do elections in this country. And let's keep going. The bill would also expand online voter registration and give states resources to have better platforms to support online voter registration. They would make it a criminal offense to interfere with another person's right to vote, offer 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote when they're 18, so they can vote when they are 18, restricting voter roll purges, like we just talked about, and restore voting rights to felons who complete prison sentences. Now, that's just the voting rights portion of this bill. It also covers things like election security, campaign finance reform, and a ton of other things, which will be amazing to have.
Campaign finance reform, definitely overdue.
So that's just one piece of legislation we should be supporting right now. The other one is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And this is where we're going to take that pin out of Shelby v. Holden, where they're actually going to restore and expand protections to the Voting Rights Act that was taken away from that Supreme Court decision back in 2013. It gives resources to federal observers, and it expands transparency procedures to fight against modern-day voter discrimination. So talking about the federal preclearance and determining of jurisdictions, it actually create federal oversight to make sure that these procedures are back in place how they should have been before the 2013 ruling, which is, again, absolutely fantastic.
Always good when we can restore civil rights that were given in the 60s.
But, like with anything else right now, it has to go to the Senate.
It has to survive the filibuster.
And apparently, this is going to be the theme of our podcast. Get rid of the filibuster.
It's time to go, Philip. I'm sticking with that bit.
All right, sounds good. And you make fun of me for my jokes.
I do. I had a terrible joke all lined up for this episode, and then I forgot it when we got through that part. I was going to, when we were talking about the Wisconsin anti-trans bill, in there, and it was, I don't know if you saw this when you read the article, a little part of me died. One of the proponents to that bill is Bonnie Blair. I don't know if you remember. She's from Wisconsin. She's a Winter Olympian, speed skating champion. She won a bunch of gold medals, one of the most decorated Winter Olympians, and she's from Wisconsin. I think she's got a statue outside of the Pennant Ice Center, and she is for this. All right, so it's so disappointing. But her name is, because she must have got married, is Bonnie Blair Crookshanks. And I was going to make the joke, like, oh, did she marry the cat from Harry Potter? And see, you laughed. It's funny. It's a funny bit. But then I totally zoned out on that when I went through. I had that joke.
You ruined your chance. Yeah.
But so I got a chance to say it now.
So to finish this all off, reach out to your representatives, reach out to your senators, and tell them to support H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Because if we don't, we're going to lose this chance. Because let me make something very clear here. We are on a very tight window to pass this type of legislation. The 2022 midterms usually go for the opposing party. And as of right now, with gerrymandering, the Republicans are predicted to win more seats to win back the majority of the House. We have to pass this stuff now. So call your representatives, call your senators, and make sure they support this type of thing.
The ACLU is a big proponent of voting rights. Maybe take a look at the ACLU.org, maybe donate.
And I'll also throw in both pieces of legislation that you can read them for yourself as well. Jason, give me something funny to end on.
I don't know. Let's all vote like 15 times in the next election.
That wasn't funny.
No, it wasn't.
Thank you for listening. We hope to see you in the next episode. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at ThinkProPod. You can email us at thinkpropod@gmail.com. And remember, when in doubt, think progressively. Hello and welcome to Think Progressively. Progressively. The good news is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The good news is that because in our next story, U.S. bishops since the November election, more than 253 bills designed. These are just the overall tactics to use let me try again. And keep Shelby v. Holder in your mind. So let's try to steelman this argument at least, right? I want to be fair. Let me try again. So let's try to at least steelman. Oh my God, come on. The bill would also expand online voter registration and voter registration.
Can you talk? Are you okay? You having a stroke?
No, not okay.
One of the worst things we've ever done as a company. Or one of the worst things we've
now
ever
look what you're doing.
Damn it.
You're spreading the lie. The truth is coming out, whether you know it or not.
Funny to end on.
We should just end it there. No, it wasn't.
I gave you the Bonnie Blair joke already, and that was funny.
I say we end it on just no, it wasn't. I think that's a good way to end it.
That's fine with me.
Okay.